There's been a lot of music coming out recently, and most of them have been trying to keep their track length and runtime fairly reasonable. But then we have other artists who just kind of go and throw everything they want into their album. As many of you guys know, if you've watched my reviews, you know that I prefer shorter albums. And if an album is going to be long, it has to be damn worth my time. Welcome to the Bar for Bar podcast, and this week I'm going to tell you why I like shorter albums. So first off, the biggest reason that I like shorter albums is because I ain't got time to listen to a long ass album. An album for me, like perfect length would be about maybe 30 to 40 minutes at max. And then anything shorter than that, I guess the shortest length that I want an album to be is about 15 minutes. Although that's not really considered an album at that point. So maybe 25 minutes. But yeah, album length is a huge deal to me. Mostly because I don't have time to just sit down and listen to a long project. Because really, who does? Because if you're actually trying to sit down and listen to the album and only focus on the album, you basically got to set aside a bunch of time to listen to it. Now, I don't really drive that often or frequently nowadays, so that's a huge disadvantage. And I don't think many people are driving as often as they used to. So, when people would be driving to and from work, that's the perfect time to listen to a longer album because most people have a 30-minute to a few hours at most commute. And for me, that's fine. If I was driving every day, cool. Get to work, listen to most of the album, and then listen to the rest of the album on the way back. Not a big deal. But given the current times, it's kind of annoying. And even when I would be driving back from or to and from work, the biggest problem is that it would start in the middle of the album. And to me, I'm the type of person who doesn't really like to resume an album from the middle unless it's like something that I've already listened to fully. So, for example, like the From King to a God from Conway that he dropped Friday. I've listened to that pretty much back to back, and I did drive around a little bit, so obviously I'm not going to be starting it from the beginning. However, the benefit with that one is it was a little bit shorter, and I was able to listen to it the day it released. So I already know how I feel about the album in general, because I was able to set aside time to sit down and listen. So when I go to the car, I'm okay with starting it like 3 tracks in or 4 tracks in at the very end of the album. That's totally fine with me because I already know what I like about this album and understand the placement of these songs. If it was to be a brand new album, for example, Detroit 2, that album is 1 hour and 11 minutes long. If I had not listened to it just on my own time, just sitting at home, it would be kind of annoying to go drive half an hour, get just under halfway through the album, and then come back and not listen to the rest of the album on the way back. But also, it's like, I would have to come back to the car later on, and I'm just like, what was happening last time I listened to it? Or what was the track that I left on? I don't really remember what's happening. So it's really just it's like a flow thing. Most of the time when people make albums, they want it to flow well. Most of the time. There have been times where I've pointed out where albums just do not flow well. But the whole purpose of creating a track list and putting songs in particular spots is because you want it to flow well and you want the listener to kind of pick up on what you're trying to tell them. You don't want to just throw a bunch of random songs at them unless it is a mixtape or a compilation tape. In that case, then fine, that's totally understandable. Even if it's like a playlist, I get it. There is a purpose for it. But with longer albums in general, it's just mostly a hassle to listen to. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who feels like that if you are one to listen to an album all the way through. I also understand that most people don't listen to albums all the way through. Some people will listen or pull up the album, listen to the song, skip halfway through it, listen to it a little bit more, and then just go to the next song. And they'll do that for the entire track list until they find songs that they enjoy just off of initial impressions. That's fine. You can do that too. There's also a bunch of other people who only listen to new songs if they're in a playlist. Like if you're on Spotify, your new release radar, like you're going to listen to the new songs on that. You're not going to listen to the actual album unless you really like that one song. So everyone's listening habits are different. I'm just speaking from the perspective of someone who will listen to an album all the way through because that's how I prefer to listen to music. Whether or not that is the right way, that is up to you to decide, because I don't think there is a right way to consume music. But regardless, other than the inconsistency of listening to an album when it's longer, because you're going to probably step away from it before you listen to the entirety of it, it's just that shorter albums generally are more focused. And they're focused in the sense that they're basically going to take you through what the artist wants you to hear. There's not really going to be any filler. Like, I guess you could say Dave East's Survival album. That one had a lot of filler on it. And I understand the purpose of it, because filler is just a term that I use for stuff that is kind of whatever to me, or stuff that is not typical of what that artist does. Dave East is a lyricist, and he's just a street rapper. But on Survival, you had a bunch of songs that were just straight up radio grabs. And yes, I understand the purpose of it, because when it's your debut album, you want to have some sort of appeal so that people can listen to you from other sources. The radio is still a fairly large source of people's listening, because not everyone's going to be listening to streaming music or like actively looking for new music on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever you listen to it on. I mean, aside from that, it's like you don't necessarily get the best music too. Again, talking about Dave East, like he is a more lyrical rapper, but on Survival, he had those radio songs that were pretty light on substance. You're just not getting what he normally does. So for fans especially, it's kind of annoying, but also for new listeners, because you will be listening to this and you're just like, wait, this radio sound isn't what he does all the time? Oh, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. So it's harmful to the artist too, because you're not really going to be looking for music that they typically make. You'd be looking for music that they made that you were interested in. The other reason I understand it is because in this streaming age, there are a few people who listen to albums all the way through, like myself. And getting extra streaming numbers on the songs that don't get as much play just accounts towards album sales. So, I mean, that makes sense, because that's why you have all these super long trap albums with short tracks. Like, they're trying to get as many listens as possible. I don't think that's always their goal, because some of those really short songs are amazing, but that is still just kind of a side effect of like making these albums super long with short songs. The other thing that this, like for me, because like I mentioned, short albums tend to be more focused and really easy to understand. But having a short album also allows the artist to have the option of a deluxe album or an album with bonus tracks. Because by doing so, I mean, so far, every bonus or deluxe album I've heard has just been like, oh, I see why these are on the deluxe edition and not on the original album. These are nowhere near as good as the original album. Like, I have never really seen a deluxe album with the additional tracks that are significantly better than the album itself. Like, I'm sure I'm wrong, and I'm sure something will come up that I'm like, oh yeah, no, I get that. But in general, like, deluxe albums aren't that great. So having a more focused, shorter album, and then a few weeks later or a month later or whenever, releasing a deluxe album with those extra tracks is probably beneficial. And that's something that I mentioned in the review of Big Sean's album. Like, if he had cut that album down to like 15 tracks, it would have been perfect. And then if he just released the remaining, 7 tracks, like as a bonus or deluxe edition, dope. It would have been much easier to listen to and probably a better album overall. But again, that's just my opinions. It also goes into the idea that when artists are in the studio, they're just making a bunch of songs. Like, there are times that I've heard that artists will record a song and it won't make the album, or it'll make an album 3 years later. Like, they can record something way, way back then, and then it finally makes the album. Like, so the thing is, like, these artists have a lot of music, and obviously they're not all going to make the album. So it's kind of interesting that the artist would still be willing to put stuff that isn't necessarily the greatest on their album. That's just me though, again, because I would imagine that the artist would want to make their next album their best one, essentially. Like, they want to one-up themselves every time rather than just stay stagnant or go down. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're not trying to actively go down or stay stagnant, but that's kind of what happens when you make albums like this, where they're just super long and there's really no substance to it, or it just kind of messes up the flow of the album or takes away from the concept. Like, again, with Detroit too, like, many people would probably be like, oh, this is a song or an album that is dedicated to Detroit, and there's not a whole lot of Detroit stuff on it. I'm sure that's not really what Sean was going for. I'm pretty sure he was just talking about, like, he is from Detroit and put on other Detroit rappers, but that is besides the point. Having a shorter album would again allow the artist to focus a lot more, because instead of having those hundreds of songs that are just recorded and never used, they'll actually be put to use. Like, the artist will go into the booth with a clear concept in their mind. For example, the tape that Conway and The Alchemist did, Lulu, that whole album was basically based around, I can't remember the name of the movie now, but it was based around a movie, and every track had some tie to the movie, and that was on purpose because that was what they were going for. Again, you can always just have an album of random tracks without any real flow if that's what you're going for, but I think most people are willing to listen to an album that is more conceptual in nature, even if it's super lightly conceptual, like in the case of Lulu. Like, the only thing that is conceptual about it is its ties to the movie. Like, the rest of it is just really Conway rapping like Conway would rap normally. Like, there's no difference. But then you also get albums like Undone by The Roots. That one is 100% a concept, and it kind of follows a life of someone. And that works really well because it's a little bit less on the nose, as Lulu is. Like, Lulu's like, yes, this is 100% what this is about. But with Undone, it takes you a few listens and you're like, oh, okay, that's what's happening. And that is a fairly short album. I believe it's like 12 to 15 tracks. I don't remember. It's been a little while since I listened to it. But it's a really solid and shorter album. Now, that's not to say that, like, this is all not to say that long albums are bad. Like, long albums can be good. Most albums that came out in the early 2000s and 90s were longer albums. And they also had a lot of filler. But that was just kind of the norm back then. They weren't really making albums to get extra streams, because that wasn't the thing. It was like actual sales. And even then, it was still focused on some sort of concept. Like, there were still things holding it together as an album. Like, nowadays you just see albums that are just like this random assortment of songs. Like, which, fine, people like that too, but for me, like, if an album has some sort of theme that runs all the way through it, it tends to be better. Personally, like, there has to be something that holds an album together, because I can like a few songs off a random album. That's different. Like, that's fine. But having an album that has a whole theme running through it or a concept just makes it a lot better. Like, it's more enjoyable. It's kind of like a movie. Like, you can watch a movie and it's going to be like, and it'll have like a beginning, middle, end, and it'll have a theme that kind of carries all through it. Most of the time, you're not going to watch a movie that's just a bunch of random clips thrown together. Like, you can, but it doesn't really lead to a fully enjoyable experience. I guess that's kind of like, that kind of goes into the difference between albums as like a sitcom versus a movie, because, you know, sitcoms don't necessarily have an overarching narrative. Like, they can just be these random stories for the most part, and there's just like a very loose narrative that's carried on through multiple seasons. But that's different from a movie, where it's like you have 1 to at most 3-4 hours, maybe, if you have a super long movie, and in that you have a theme going through it. So having an album that's like longer and more sporadic really does feel like a sitcom. Like, it's cool, like, it's fun to watch, but it's nothing that like you're really getting a whole lot out of sometimes. Like, sure, you might, like, some episodes are obviously favorites of people, so that's kind of like how the music is. Like, you like these particular tracks, but you may not like the whole album like in its entirety. And I think just having a short album really allows for a shorter experience. Well, obviously a shorter experience, but it also allows you, the listener, to get more out of it. Like, you'd be listening to music and actually gain something from it. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that music isn't for that sort of engagement, but I know there are people who want that. I know I'm one of those people that want that. That might not be what the masses want, but I mean, I'm sure if you make the comparison to a movie, they'd be like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. I can understand why, but again, everyone's listening habits are different. Some people like long albums, some people like short albums. I'm just really saying why I like short albums. Like, the biggest thing really is I ain't got time. But also, it's just the cohesion of it. Like, I don't enjoy listening to an album that is just all over the place and full of tracks that I would never listen to. I would like some sort of consistency. Just saying. Anyways, I'm going to stop it at that, because I'm just going to start rambling on and just talk in circles. Comment below if you have opinions about album length. I mean, obviously I do, because I mention it in every review, and I've done a whole talk about it. But also like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and please stay safe out there.